Hello class, welcome back to the Chong channel. So today what we're going to do is look at a right triangle. So once again, this thing here is a right triangle because it has a right angle. And when we have a right triangle and that's a right angle, the side that's opposite the right angle is called a hypotenuse. So if I were to redraw this over here, this is a right triangle and this thing here is called the hypotenuse. Okay. So now going back to this situation, what we have in these problems is an altitude drawn to the hypotenuse. So whenever you have an altitude drawn to the hypotenuse, most teachers like to teach the mean proportional theorem, but I'm going to teach it with a Chong twist to it. So just so you can see what a mean proportional theorem is all about, it's this. So they said to find the leg, you have to follow this formula according to this situation. And you can pause and rewind the video when you want to see the details. And then if you wanted to deal with the altitude, this is the formula you use according to this situation. Now let's put a Chong twist to this. So what I noticed is that a lot of students mess up the proportions, and so once you mess up the proportion, your answers end up becoming wrong. So I made up two formulas, and so I call this the altitude drawn to the hypotenuse Chong formulas. So let's say we wanted to deal with the leg. Okay, hold on one second. Let's go back for a moment. So both of the formulas that I'm going to talk about has to deal with the hypotenuse, okay? So if you look over here, this altitude leads to two parts of the hypotenuse. Part 1 hypotenuse, part 2. Or this could be part 1 hypotenuse, or this can be part 2 hypotenuse, okay? So altitude leads to two parts of the hypotenuse. So therefore, the altitude formula is altitude squared is part 1 hypotenuse times part 2 hypotenuse. Okay, so once again, the altitude leads to two parts of the hypotenuse. So altitude squared is part 1 hypotenuse times part 2 hypotenuse. Now the second one, we have a leg. Well, let's think about our own legs. We have two legs, right? And so in this right triangle, we have two legs. Now, how do we know which leg we're dealing with? Well, let's pretend I'm fighting, right? And I have a group that is bothering me. And let's say I had to fight and do some kicking. So I'm going to kick with my leg. Now, if I'm looking at this leg over here, who do I kick first? Well, I'm going to kick the one that's next to me first. So this is what we call the adjacent part of the hypotenuse. Adjacent means next to that leg. So this is adjacent. And if I'm fighting a group, well, I don't just kick the one that's next to me. I deal with the whole thing. So once again, leg squared is adjacent part of the hypotenuse times the whole. Now, same thing here. Let's say I'm dealing with this leg. Pretend I'm fighting again. So who do I kick first? I'm going to kick this part of the hypotenuse first. And then I'm going to deal with the whole hypotenuse. So let's write this out. Leg squared is adjacent part of the hypotenuse times the whole hypotenuse. Now notice that both of these formulas that I have developed both deal with the hypotenuse. So altitude and leg both deal with the hypotenuse. All right, so let's look at this problem. So here it says in the diagram below a triangle ABC, angle ABC is a right angle, AC is 12, AD is 8, and altitude BD is drawn. So once again, this is the altitude. And you know what? Let me go ahead and label that. So this is altitude. And just so that we review, this is a right triangle. And if this is the right angle, this here would be called our hypotenuse. So this is the situation, altitude drawn to the hypotenuse. We want to find the length of line segment BC. So this is the line segment BC we're trying to look for. So let me put a question mark. So first of all, what is given here? Well, this thing that I'm trying to look for is called a leg. and so I need the leg formula. And remember, I kick with my leg, and am I fighting? Remember, the hypotenuse is ganging up on me. Oh no. So what am I going to do? I'm going to kick the one that's next to me first. Oh, I don't have a number here. Well, I do know that the whole hypotenuse is 12 and the bottom part is 8. So if I want to find this, I would subtract. So 12 minus 8 is 4. So this part here is 4. So going back, leg squared is adjacent part of the hypotenuse times the whole hypotenuse. So let's write out the formula. Leg squared is adjacent part of the hypotenuse times the whole hypotenuse. So I have here the leg. Well, I want to look for it, so let me give that a variable x. So x squared. So once again, this is my leg. Which part of the hypotenuse is adjacent or next to that x? Well, it's 4. So let's write 4. And then what is my whole hypotenuse? 12. Now, we can multiply and simplify, but what we're going to end up doing is breaking up numbers. So let's just leave it this way. So what's the opposite of a square? The opposite of a square is square root. So what I'm going to do is square root the left. What you do on the left, you do to the right. So the square and square root cancels. So we're left with x. So whenever you have a square root, the goal is to free as many numbers outside of that square root. But for you to be able to free them out, you have to be a perfect square. Now, just a quick review of perfect squares. What are perfect squares? Perfect squares means perfectly the same two things multiplied to give you a perfect square. So for example, if I were to say 2 times 2, well, 4 is a perfect square because two of the same numbers multiplied to give me that 4. And then 9 would be a perfect square, 3 times 3. 16 would be a perfect square, 4 times 4, and so on. So once again, going back to this square root, my goal is to free as many perfect squares out of the square root. Well, first of all, let's deal with this one. The square root of 4 is 2, so I'm going to put that 2 out. So think of this square root like jail. I want to free as many square roots out. Now, 4 was inside jail. Now, when he comes out, becomes a new number. So now that's 2. Now let's break this number up. So what two numbers multiply to give you 12? Well, 4 times 3. I'm trying to pick numbers that are perfect squares. So once again, the square root of 4 is 2. So when it comes out, another 2 comes out, right? So this was the 2 from before, and now I have the 2 that comes out. Now, what do I do with these two numbers? Well, if you don't see a symbol, there's always that invisible dot that's hiding for multiplication. And so what number is left inside? 3. Can I break down that 3 anymore? No. So now let's simplify. 2 times 2 is 4, and I have 4 square root of 3. Now going back to the question says to solve for the question mark, which is x, and so we are done. Okay, so quick review for those of you who are still confused. Leg squared. So once again, this was my leg. And let's say the hypotenuse is ganging up on me. Oh no, so I'm going to kick the one that's next to me first. So this is the adjacent part of the hypotenuse times the whole hypotenuse. So adjacent part of the hypotenuse times the whole hypotenuse. Okay, hope that helped. Bye-bye.